for both the drought and also to the protection for flooding the area of Brisbane. Here you see the design for the broad floodplains and also the confluential area. It has some ingredients. So the first one is that we are making the infrastructure, the railway line, but also the highway, we make it permeable, so then the flood can go through it. But also we are thinking about to realign the big infrastructure. So the highway now is going through the floodplain, and maybe on the long term we should put it out of the floodplain and with only a small crossing through by a bridge over the floodplain. So that provides us in every times a connection through the valley, but it will also give a rescue way to evacuate the people out of this area. In Holland, we also have floodplains. We're also creating them by relocation the dikes. And here is a project of SEQWaterFutures. There we built a new bridge to the island of SEQWaterFutures, and in case of high river levels, the river is going through the bridge to the highway. Other ingredients are resilient housing and farmyards in the floodplains. Maybe we can build mounds, the farm housing, keep them on mounds, and create riparian zones along the creeks to keep the sediment into the river. And also create hydraulic reliefs to spread the water in case of floods. It will spread over the whole valley. And here you see the principle of hydraulic reliefs. And we will lowering the sediment ridges along the river so the water can go out and spread over the valley. And this project also in the Netherlands, it's called the Noordwaard, with repairing zones along the creeks, new creeks, and in between agriculture. So a very nice landscape, ecological landscape together combined with water and nature and agriculture. And resilient farming on mounds. This is the project of Ipswich. They put farmhouses on mounds, 5-6 meters above the level of the surface, and they built 8 mounds. And that's maybe also the solution for Lockyer Valley, where here you can save, living safe on the mounds. You put all your machinery on it, and on the lower parts you can still make agriculture, crops, meadows, things like that. In the upper catchment, the mountain creeks, we have the principle of contour banks to keep the sediment, to slow and also to infiltrate the water in case of droughts. And then the water can infiltrate it, and then you can pump it up as groundwater. But it can infiltrate when it's raining. And here you see it's a little bit of messy picture, but here you see that contour banks, how it works. And another principle for upper catchment is retention dams and some wires. We put it in the creek also to retain the water, to store the water, to delay it. So that are the principles that we are developed for the Lockyer Valley. So I think now it's your turn.
Great.
Yes. I don't know. Some tile sighting.
Someone's brain circuits, right? Hi, I'm Derek. I'm from St. Louis, from the United States. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the beautiful weather. I can't believe this is winter. Our winter in the States is quite different, but our summers are very hot, so we kind of understand that as well. Thanks to my group. It was really a great 2 days, and we're going to continue tomorrow, so hopefully we can get some good feedback. So we were tasked with the Bremer catchment, and this is kind of the first, skip ahead here. But the kind of the last overall drawing that the students worked on, and I kind of made, I think, a little messy afterwards, but kind of showing this idea that this whole catchment, just like we're talking about, if you scale this in, from this zone, we're looking at kind of this part right here. It in and of itself is an integrated kind of approach as well with these different zones. So we've got kind of this is going from the highland zone where the ridges are down through the overlands. But what's different from this, and some of these very similar kind of approaches that Tijs just explained would probably hold true through here. So I think it's important to know that each catchment is not completely different from other, but different kind of ideas and strategies go across. But what obviously makes this catchment significantly different is it all comes down to Ipswich and a suburban urbanized area that ultimately leads to where these three rivers come together and then of course into Brisbane. But so for the Bremer, like I said, there's a highland zone which right now predominantly is grazing, minor cropping, but also is zoned for future development. High risk to infrastructure and life, obviously, with these flash floods. The overland zone, grazing and rural growth, cumulative risk to infrastructure, of course depreciation of assets, and then the urban river zone, urban suburban redevelopment, more risk to infrastructure because you have these rail lines and highways coming through there that could be impacted by, especially the 2011 plus 30 kind of flood event, and of course this kind of choke point where it accelerates the flow downstream, that transitional zone that we've been talking about. But what we first did as the group is we actually zoomed into Ipswich itself. And it's kind of hard to read this drawing here, and these are kind of stating the obvious, probably to most people in the room, but it's important that we kind of lay the framework. So of course, like many places throughout the region, there's building in floodplains, similar types of buildings and built environment are happening both in non-risk and at-risk zones. There's a lack of access to the water, even though there's a riverfront trail right now. There's more potential, we think, for connection over time, over many years of these areas to the river, to the Bremer River here. This notion that there are plans and existing regional nature corridors, but right now they're probably not as connected as they could be, and we see that as a huge potential with this notion of water, that you would connect these nature corridors. The lack of flood regulation, of course. Like I mentioned, Ipswich is a choke point, meaning it's this funnel condition. There's pollution throughout, and that also includes past Ipswich into this transitional zone where there's industrial areas that flood, and of course that's what brings us into Brisbane. The history of coal mining, something definitely contended with. I keep joking, not joking, but when I was back in the States, I saw this, I was watching the feed on New York Times and I saw a video of a sinkhole in Australia. I'm like, where is that? I emailed Sam, I said, is this where we're working? He goes, that's Ipswich. So it's like, oh, that's exactly where we're working. And of course, not just specific to this catchment, but the kind of how infrastructure might not be is kind of related to the landscape as it potentially could be in the future. So again, that's just the same kind of thing we looked at. So this zooming up, so the first zone, which here we call the flash zone, that's really kind of a negative connotation, but it's more on the highlands, is that in terms of strategy, so we came up with a few strategies that could happen in each one of these three zones. So this is making our way from the ridge, and we'll get down to Ipswich. So there's existing kind of revegetation happening up along the ridge. We, of course, want that to encourage that to continue over time to help with resisting the flash floodings. When it gets more into the kind of gentler areas and along the creeks, of course, more new vegetation, but also this idea of these vegetative speed bumps, which are similar to what Tijs was talking about, these terraces that could be placed with the contours as they make their way down to the creek, so they would hold water, both to resist flooding, but also recharge the ground. So this gets us into issues of course, land ownership and how does it work with the farmers and things like that, but those are what could be thought about over time. Of course, the fire management regime, what I just said, that needs to be a collaborative approach. But there's also a dam up here too, which over time could maybe have some more storage if it needs to hold more, or also be used for both functional purposes such as irrigation, but also recreation as well. And then so this is just a more kind of tailored version of that sketch that we did that shows how these things, so for instance, these little yellow guys would be those speed bumps that would kind of stop, slow the water as it makes its way into the creeks and ultimately down through here. Moving into the middle zone, the overland zone. So just kind of to get your bearings, sorry these drawings are moving around. So Ipswich would be up here, the Highlands would be down here, and you'd have these kind of creeks coming through here. We were told that there's this 10-mile swamp, a potential site for kind of rethinking or bringing back a swamp river edge condition. So something like that, if we think that that's a precedent or existing project that might be working, that can't just be a one-off. You need to aggregate that idea throughout the valley. So could there be more of those along the creeks? And just like kind of multiple benefits, it just doesn't delay the water, it also can treat the water when you have this along the edge, riparian edges. And then also within those would be more of those kind of terraces and speed bumps that would slow the water before it came down there. When you start to connect these things together, that's where, in the instance of where these regional nature corridors actually start to connect, whether it's for koalas or what have you, but we can start to talk about that all connecting. A big question mark, of course, is what to do with the coal sites, right? Ones that are either existing or historical. We think over time there can maybe be a future industry thinking about how do you remediate these sites or turn them into other things. We don't have a solution for that right now, but I think that's something that needs to be thought about. And again, kind of an overall diagram of how you can see the swamp areas, the terraces, the coal, etc., how they feed ultimately down to Ipswich. Some more sketches of that. And then finally, in that urban kind of choke point area in Ipswich and then areas around that as well, here you see just an overall sketch of the catchment, so from ridge to ridge, and then within that valley, you have this very rich topography throughout the Brisbane region, where you have things that are up, that won't flood, but areas that will flood as well. So over time, could you start to find opportunities in the urban grid to start to bring the blue and the green into that context that most of the times would be dry, but also could fill up during different flood events? Of course, that brings up issues of heritage structures that might be in those areas, but those are resilient to flooding, as we know. But over the long term, hopefully it would start to incentivize ideas of densifying some of those safer areas. And one of the students did this nice sketch that could show that those ideas could start to repeat throughout river edge conditions and how you base that into the existing urban development. And finally, within Ipswich, it can scale very much down to a very fine grain, working with existing property ownership, small swales, areas to hold water, kind of a water grid that would make its way throughout the city as well. And I think we will